Welcome back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. It's that time of year, folks. 'Tis the season for the yearly Air Force One special. It is Apple's WWDC event time. It is coming up this week on Monday is when it kicks off with their keynote event. So we're going to be breaking some of that down, what to expect, some things that we're kind of expecting to see, some things that, would be nice to see, kind of, all that good stuff. As well as there was some news that broke this week from some cybersecurity researchers that found some quite embarrassingly bad rookie mistakes that were made by some web browser extension developers. So we're going to be kind of breaking that down as well. And as for good measure, we got some random unsolicited segment thrown in there about VR gaming and driving. Why? This isn't a podcast devoted to any of that, but this is my podcast. I make the rules, so that's why we're going to be talking about it. But before we get into that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is, what was the name of the intelligent user interface office assistant in Microsoft Office from 1997 to 2003? So what was the name of that intelligent user interfaced office assistant in Microsoft Office from 1997 to 2003? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get into the cybersecurity tip, there's another cybersecurity related thing that happened this week, which is honestly quite embarrassing. So, for all the scammers out there, I'm talking directly to you right now, so listen closely. If you're trying to pull the old suspicious activity or suspicious login attempt on your account BS shenanigans, at least put in some gosh dang effort into your scam attempt, because if you're spoofing someone else's text or someone else's number for your SMS text message, and then in the message saying to call a number that's completely different from the message from the phone number you're allegedly sending it from, I mean, it's kind of a red flag that you're not being legit and that this is a scam. Not to mention the fact that the number you're using has absolutely no association whatsoever with the company that is allegedly the one that had this suspicious activity. And what I mean by that is, for instance, let's say this text message came from, allegedly, Capital One, saying that there was suspicious activity or a suspicious login on your account. And the number that texted you had absolutely zero affiliation to Capital One, as well as the number they told you to call. Pretty big red flag, pretty darn obvious. So if you're going to try to scam people, at least put in some effort. Now, I get that there are some people that aren't as technologically savvy and that they might fall for this, and that's what you're preying on. In which case, you are very sick individuals, and you know what? I am just going to cut it off there before I get too heated about this, but needless to say, I got one of these texts this week, and it was so bad that I just feel like I had to call it out. Now, maybe me calling it out is actually a bad thing because they might actually step up their game, but they have been trying this tactic for years at this point, so I'm not sure that they are really going to step up their game. But that's not to say that other scammers out there are not stepping up their game, because in recent years, there has definitely been a rise in scam messages coming through iMessage, which is a lot harder to detect from spam filters, of course, because it's all end-to-end encrypted. And then we talked about a couple weeks ago, I think it was more than a couple weeks ago, that whole PayPal incident where someone hacked. It was something to do with like how the API to like send emails or whatever. It was some like DocuSign thing or whatever. And it was basically like very legit looking emails to like try to scam people. So the scams are definitely getting more sophisticated these days, but it's still absolutely hilarious when, you have AI, right, that can make some very, very convincing scam messages, yet you're still falling back to this like this might be something that you could get a decent amount of people maybe in like the early 2000s, when the internet was still kind of in its infancy, and scams of this kind of style were still kind of new at the time, but at this point it's just so painfully obvious. But yeah, like I said, I could go on about this, but I am just going to stop there before I get too heated on the subject. But since we're on the topic of cybersecurity, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So stop me if you've heard this one before, but don't hard code credentials like passwords, encryption keys, or APIs, API tokens, etc. in your code base. How many times has this same exact thing been a cybersecurity tip? That is a good question. I do not know. I think I have lost count because how frequently it has been a cybersecurity tip. But the fact of the matter is, every time it's a cybersecurity tip, there is yet another instance where some company, some group of developers, or however they're categorizing themselves, makes this exact same mistake. And this week is no different. So, cybersecurity researchers from Symantec have identified several Google Chrome extensions which pose various privacy and security risks to users because of these exact issues. So, essentially, what these extensions are doing is transmitting data unencrypted over HTTP and exposing this sensitive information during during the actual usage of these extensions. So it'll be sending things like browser domains, machine IDs, usage analytics, all of that good juicy details unencrypted just directly over the internet. So anyone that is sitting in the middle sniffing that traffic will be able to see everything that is going on. So some of the hard-coded secrets in some of these extensions include things like API keys, tokens, and could be exploited by attackers because they are just hard-coded into the extension itself. Now, some of the extensions include SEM rush rank and PI rank, which transmit data over HTTP. BrowSec VPN, which uses HTTP. It basically uses an HTTP call if you're trying to uninstall it. I guess that kind of shows how quality of a security tool it is if it's using an unsecure protocol like HTTP. MSN New Tab and MSN Homepage, which transmit a unique machine identifier and other details over HTTP. I guess Microsoft doesn't really care, I guess, since I'm pretty sure MSN is a Microsoft thing. Dual Safe Password Manager, which constructs HTTP-based URL requests with information about the extension version and the user's browser language, which let's just acknowledge the fact that this is a password manager. It is a security tool meant to house your passwords, which, if your passwords get leaked, you're basically toast. So, a security tool using very insecure means for its actual application. Now, one of the security researchers actually pointed out as much, and they said, "quote Although credentials and passwords do not appear to be leaked, the fact that the password manager uses unencrypted requests for telemetry erodes trust in its overall security posture." which I don't think I could have said that any better myself. And yeah, it's quite embarrassing that you're a security tool, yet you're using unsecure means for your communication for some rather sensitive data like telemetry type data, which we can have the debate all day long till we're blue in the face on if telemetry data is actually a good thing, if it should be collected in the first place. Now, for what it's worth, there are some valid use cases for telemetry, and telemetry can, in some cases, get a bad rap. Thanks, Microsoft. Um, but the general idea of gathering user analytics to see how users are using your application from a developer's perspective can help you identify areas that might need tweaked, areas that can be improved, things like this. The problem is how you collect that telemetry data and how you use it. Now, if you're collecting it in a purely anonymous manner where you're just seeing like, you just get data regarding like, yeah, say 75% of your users use this specific feature, while this a feature that you just pushed in your latest update only has like 5% adoption, and you get no more information than that, everything is anonymous. That's one thing. But if you have direct correlations that this user used these features and this user only used that feature, that's where you kind of get into the gray area, because that's where you get into the whole selling of user data shenanigans and the whole privacy debate. But I think that's probably about as deep as I'm going to go in that. Of course, we could talk and argue about this till we're blue in the face, but suffice it to say, we're just going to leave it there. Some other extensions: online security and privacy, AVG, online security, and others, all of which expose hard-coded API secrets and tokens within the extension itself. Now, one of the reasons why this is bad is these vulnerabilities could essentially allow attackers to intercept and modify data, leading to some serious consequences such as profiling, phishing, and targeting attacks. Because, like I said, first off, if you're sending things like API tokens or requests or any kind of telemetry data unencrypted, anyone that's sitting in the middle of that connection and sniffing that traffic is able to read everything. It's just in plain text. They can see everything. And if there's any kind of, so in essence, if they can see what kind of traffic you're sending, they can, like we said, profile, fish, all that good stuff. Because if they can build a profile on you, they can kind of figure out what you're interested, what might make you be more susceptible to fall for a phishing attack, thus sending the successful phishing campaign, which you could technically argue that's more of a spear phishing approach since it's more targeted directly to you. But regardless, it's not a good thing. And obviously, the recommendation from the security researcher here is to switch to HTTPS and actually use encryption, storing your credentials securely, i.e., not hard coding them into the code base, and then rotating secrets around to minimize the risk. So, one of the things that I think is pretty typical when it comes to you creating an API key for any kind of like API is, by default, they typically have an expiration date. And part of the reason for that is this exact use case. For whatever reason, if you lose the API key, or maybe someone gets access to it with, they shouldn't, they get unauthorized access, it basically limits the damage they can do because it's only valid for a certain period of time. And that's one of the benefits that the cybersecurity researchers talk about here with the whole kind of rotating your keys around, because it minimizes that risk of, if you do happen to hard code it into your software, or you accidentally commit it into your Git repo or something like that, it's only going to be valid for so long before it then eventually gets switched out to something else, and then that old token is no longer valid. But if you happen to use any of these extensions, you might want to consider uninstalling them or finding other ones, or maybe just don't use Chrome or any of its clones. But I know that's probably not going to persuade many people. But there, I will have the link for this article down in the show notes below, which I think also has a couple other web browser extensions that I didn't get to touch on here. So definitely go give that a look if you are interested. But yeah, that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Do not be hard coding your credentials into your code base. So moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So, have you ever had one of those weeks where you had plans of doing a lot of stuff and then ended up accomplishing absolutely nothing? Because that was kind of one of the weeks that I had, which I guess isn't entirely true because shortly before recording this podcast, I was looking around on my websites and stuff, and I realized that the darkassassins.inc.com website had its SSL cert expired. So the day I'm recording this, apparently I wasn't paying attention, and the cert expired yesterday. So that was kind of embarrassing. Not sure if anyone actually saw it or not, since I don't know what kind of traffic the website gets. But yeah, that is kind of embarrassing. Although uh, like I have heard it stated, it's better if you catch the error than having, say, like a customer or someone trying to view your website or whatever inform you that your website is having issues, because that's obviously not a very good thing. But the thing that's weird about it is it uses the website's hosted on GitLab, and it has like the auto renew cert thing set up. So I'm not entirely sure how it got into a state where the cert didn't auto renew. But I did go in and kind of fixed it, so now everything's back to normal and working like it should be. But yeah, there was a brief period of time where if you went to the darkassassins.inc.com website, you would get a nice scary pop-up from your web browser saying that it is trying to potentially steal your information because it has an invalid certificate because it was expired. So I got that fixed. So that was, I guess, kind of the one nerdy thing that I got up to. But various things kind of came up throughout the week that kind of derailed some of the other plans and stuff that I had wanted to do. But one thing that I did get to do was play some VR gaming, which I guess is cool. Um, I just felt like I needed the Need for Speed. Not the game Need for Speed. I don't think I've actually ever played that game. But I did do some racing in VR. I have like a sim rig and everything that over the past like few weeks and whatnot, I've been kind of like upgrading, and adding some better components and just in general getting a better rig, because the one I had previously was kind of a pain to set up, and it wasn't the most, I guess, stable and secure, because like depending on how like uh I don't think violent is the right word, but depending on like the motions that you were doing, like kind of the whole rig would kind of move, which obviously isn't ideal. So I got one that's more sturdy, and so far it's been very good. But I gotta say, VR virtual reality racing is pretty incredible. Now, I have stated before that the last time that I tried anything VR related was back in was basically over a decade ago. I think it was around the time when the first Oculus Rift came out, and I was at like some game. I forget what it was called. Jam Tech. I'm not sure if that means anything to anyone, but it was basically kind of like a video game conference of sorts, where it's kind of like a session, like I think it was an all day thing, and basically went there and just kind of like learned how to use Unity and like make video games and that kind of thing. It was pretty fun from what I remember. But one of the things that they had there was an Oculus Rift kind of like demoing virtual reality, and I thought it was like the coolest thing in the world. But then never got and touched anything VR related until recently. As part of my sim rig update, I decided to buy a VR headset. No, I did not get the Apple Vision Pro, which at some point I think it still would be cool to use the Vision Pro, but then again, that price tag is very very hard to justify. Now, I know you can go and like schedule an appointment at like an Apple store and try it out for free and whatnot, but that also kind of seems like some effort that I don't necessarily feel like putting in. But anyway, I did get a VR headset. If anyone's interested, it was the PlayStation VR 2 because I have a PlayStation and it just kind of works with that. Plus, I kind of feel like if I went with the other dominant headset on the market, that being the Meta Quest, what are they at? Meta Quest 3, Meta Quest Pro, whatever it is, I would feel like I would be I'm trying to think of the right phrasing here. I would be giving money to the Zuck, and I don't want to give money to the Zuck because I don't necessarily agree with a lot of his business practices. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you know I am not a big fan of Facebook, Meta, and basically anything that the Zuck owns, but that's kind of a tangent in and of itself. Um, anyway, so the thing with the VR headset and racing, I don't think it's technically made me any faster. At least not yet. Now maybe I'm just trying to say that it will to like, as like a coping mechanism. I don't know. But I will say it has added a significant amount of depth perception because obviously if you have like this headset on, it does a lot better job of like simulating the 3D effect compared to just a flat screen, that being like your TV or monitors or whoever you have your setup. So in that sense, it's been very beneficial because it's a lot easier to like judge braking zones and everything, which is very nice. Also, the fact that you're fully immersed in the space itself, like you're physically in the car and you can like look around and everything, is pretty dang cool. Which, for reference, before I got the VR headset, I always hated the kind of in-car view in racing games. I think in part because it never really felt like that's what I would be seeing from where I was sitting. Since like the distance that I would be from like the computer monitor or the TV or whatever was never really at that distance where it seems like, yes, if I was actually sitting in this car, this is my view, because I'd either be too far away or too close or whatever the case is. So generally what I would always do is just have like the very front view of the car where you basically don't see the car at all, and you just kind of have a view of what's in front of you because I don't know, it just kind of, I guess, made it. I don't know. I just like that view better. Anyway, when you're in VR, that the only view that you get is inside the cockpit. But of course, if you're inside the car and you're sitting in the seat, everything looks like you would expect if you were actually there, which is very very nice and very cool to see. And it was kind of very cool in the sense because I was basically quite literally strapping myself into a race car just to drive fast. Now, the one downside of driving fast in a sim racing game is you don't actually feel the speed. Unless, of course, you have one of those rigs that basically costs more than a car, which I think really only exist in like professional race teams, like environments or wherever they have like their headquarters for like drivers to sit in, that basically fine tune the rig basically down to the T of what the car their driver would be driving in to get the most realistic experience. But even in those cases, you don't necessarily get every single feeling. But of course, it's going to be a lot more than just a stationary rig like what mine is. Um, but still, seeing everything whiz by you and having like that force feedback in the steering wheel is at least something. Um, but as I was, playing these racing games and just enjoying the feeling of going fast, in this virtual reality space, it got me thinking back to a quote from the Ford versus Ferrari movie, which, as a bit of a tangent, if you haven't seen that movie, it is a fantastic movie, and I definitely highly encourage everyone to watch it because it is fantastic. But it is also kind of so I unintentionally created a tradition for myself, and that is every June, right before the 24 Hours of Le Mans. I always do two things. That is, I hop in my sim rig and play and just do a bunch of sim racing time on the Circuit de la Sarthe, or the 24 Hours of Le Mans track, and watch Ford versus Ferrari, usually the day before the 24 Hours of Le Mans. I don't know how slash when this started. I think it was like a couple years ago. I just happened to do it once. And it was basically to psych myself up and, get prepped and get hyped for it. Because it probably is one of my favorite race events, if not my favorite race event. At some point, it would be nice to go there. But obviously, that's not happening this year. But sometime that's everyone has kind of like their bucket list of items that I think that would probably be something that would be on the bucket list. Which, by the way, in case anyone is curious, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is next weekend. So if you're interested in tuning in, kind of get ready for that because it is coming up. But anyway, back to the movie. There's a quote in the movie by Carroll Shelby, which is voiced by Matt Damon, where he says, quote, "There's a point at 7,000 RPM where everything fades. The machine becomes weightless. It just disappears. All that's left is a body moving through space and time. At 7,000 RPM, that's where you meet it. You feel it coming. It creeps up on you, close in your ear, and it asks you, the only question that matters, who are you?" And obviously, if you are in a sim rig that does not move, you're obviously not moving, as the quote suggests. But at least if you're in a VR headset, you at least kind of see the movement, even if you don't necessarily physically feel it. But everything else about that quote kind of holds up, because especially if you're in a VR headset, because which I get that this is not a car podcast, or we don't usually typically talk about driving and stuff, which the only time I can really sneak this in here and still have it be relevant if it's relating to technology. And in this case, I'm using VR as the crutch here because VR is technology, and I am using that as an avenue to talk about driving. Just like a few weeks ago, I talked about curvature and I was able to kind of tie in driving into that. So basically, I'm doing it again. But so sometimes we can view our technology as an extension of ourselves, right? Like, I think at this point in time, a lot of people kind of view like their cell phone, for instance, as an extension of them. Like, if you don't know the answer for something, what are you doing? You're pulling out your phone and you're looking up the answer. It's an extension essentially of your knowledge base. But when it comes to driving, basically the same thing applies. And when I say driving, I'm not talking about your standard commuting to and from the office or to and from the grocery store, that kind of thing. But like, if you're in a sim rig or you're just going out for a drive just to enjoy the drive, it just feels really good when you can get this connection with the car, and it basically just feels like an extension of yourself. And if you've never experienced this, I'm not exactly sure what to tell you, or how to describe it, But I guess my recommendation is, because breaking the speed limit is illegal, and typically one way to kind of feel that, I guess, feeling is if you're going very fast. Now, if you have a track that's nearby you and you can get some track time, that would be one way to do it. But my other recommendation would be to use that curvature uh, app that I talked about a few weeks ago to find a curvy road near you and just go for a drive on a curvy road. Because the nice thing about twisty, curvy roads like that is you can have a heck of a lot of fun while also not doing insanely fast speeds and like breaking serious laws. um and you kind of get the same experience and feeling. I guess it depends on what car you're driving, of course, because some cars these days are just so numb to the point that you feel nothing. But if you are in a good car that you can get that feeling, um, going out just to a drive and focusing on the drive and kind of focusing just being you in the car, feeling, the gear changes, feeling, the car beneath you as you turn into corners, fearing the steering wheel kind of push back against you. And it's just a fantastic feeling hearing the rumble and the roar of the engine as you work the throttle. It's very, very intoxicating. And the nice thing about like a sim rig too is you can kind of get most of that, as well as going a heck of a lot faster, safer. And I'm trying to think where I was going with this. I just got lost. But yeah. So the cool thing about the sim rig, right, is you don't like in a real car. If you're driving your actual car, you're probably going to be a lot more cautious with it because you don't want to wreck it. If you're in a sim rig, it obviously doesn't matter, because if you crash, you just restart and your car has magically been healed. You don't have to worry about repair bills or insurance or any of that. You can just doesn't matter. But the other nice thing too is it allows you to go very, very fast, push the limits, and just feel in tuned with the car. Especially if you're in VR, you kind of get that full immersion, and it's just fantastic. And I've one other thing that I've talked about is this idea of escapism. And previously, I've talked that coding for me has also been an avenue of escapism. But driving is definitely one of those as well. And I don't mean, like I said, I don't mean the commute, just standard commuting from A to B, sitting in traffic all the time. But when like the idea of escapism, I mentioned, I don't know, it was probably over a year ago at this point, or close to a year ago, when I talked about how I got back into programming my Pokemon video game, and I hadn't done it for a while, and just getting into it, and everything just kind of like faded, and it was just me and the computer and the keyboard and the code, and everything was just like pure bliss, because that was like pure escapism. Same thing with driving in some cases, and of course, when I'm talking about driving, I've kind of alluded to it a little bit. But I don't really take pleasure in commuting from A to B and sitting in traffic. I don't particularly find that very enjoyable, and I don't think most people do. But when I'm talking about driving, I'm also not talking about, breaking all kinds of traffic laws in the seek of a thrill. Um, but kind of going back to what the quote from the Ford versus Ferrari movie, everything fades, right? You don't feel like you're sitting in this big, heavy metal box, devoid of all connection from the road. Now, like I mentioned, there are some cars that is basically their entire MO. Um, they're very numb, basic, and that is like their entire selling point, right? Like, driving is a pain, no one wants to do it, so let's just make it as comfortable and non-intrusive as possible. Which I mean, maybe if you're trying to commute from A to B, sure, but if you're trying to like actually enjoy a drive, that is probably one of the worst cars that you can be in. Um, but another quote from the movie is when Ken Miles, who is voiced by, or is played by Christian Bale, he's talking. This one scene, he's talking to his son, and he says, "Out there, there is the perfect lap. No mistakes. Every gear change, every corner, perfect." And whether you are in a sim racing game or you're in real life, if you ever hit a perfect shift or you ever hit a perfect corner, I don't know how to describe the feeling, but it is quite incredible. And that kind of also goes back to the kind of car that you're driving. Obviously some cars you cannot change gears in them. But if you do have a car that has like the even if you don't have a manual transmission car, even if it just has like the paddle shifters, feeling like the shifts and getting those shifts right is still a pretty fantastic feeling. But even if you can't, get the gear changes, there is a noticeable difference. Even if you're just driving on the street and you're not, trying to, break traffic laws and go, as fast as possible, there is a noticeable difference of when you take a corner and you know that you nailed that corner versus when you didn't necessarily take the best line through that corner when you're driving on the street. Now, obviously, not every corner this is even going to be possible in because there are things called lanes on roads, and typically the optimal racing line to get you that perfect corner would require you to break some traffic laws, i.e., crossing double yellows, for example, which is a very bad idea. So do not do it. But even still, there are some times where you can kind of go around a corner and you just feel like you nailed that corner. And that is a super amazing feeling, kind of going back to the whole escapism thing. Um, and I guess the point of this entire tangent was it was very nice to just completely escape from the world and just enjoy a good drive, even if it was with a VR headset on. But that's not to say that I haven't gone out and enjoyed drives in my own car before, because I have on many occasions, and it has been very, very enjoyable. But with that, let us actually get back to something that isn't a stretch to be considered technology related. That being the Air Force One show coming up this week, aka WWDC. So, WWDC, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, starts on Monday, and of course, it is a entire week long thing. But the main keynote event is going to be on Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. Pacific. So make sure to mark your calendars. Typically, Apple streams it on their website, and I'm pretty sure they also like stream it on YouTube as well. So definitely you have opportunities to watch it live if you want. Otherwise, you can of course always watch the recording after the fact. Um, but if I'm being honest, I'm not sure how Apple is going to top the opening of last year's WWDC, because if you remember, last year's WWDC started in a cargo plane flying over Cupertino, and Craig Federighi is, giving all the people at Apple that's in the plane like a pep talk before they all suit up in like their jumpsuits and skydive out of the plane, listening to while Phil Schiller blasts some Motley Crue, and and Craig Federighi puts on this helmet that is in the shape of his hair, and it was absolutely incredible. I mean, the whole like "Kickstart My Heart" thing by Motley Crue just kind of playing in the background just kind of bumped it up another level. But I really don't know how they're going to top that intro this year. Now, of course, I'm hoping that they do, because if they do manage to top it, that's just going to be a whole other level because the last year's was I thought was pretty dang good. But also just Craig's antics in general is something that we are definitely going to be watching for. At least I am. Like last year, not only did he have that whole skydiving thing, but then there was like one of the transitions. I don't remember specifically where it happened. I don't remember if it was going from like Mac OS to iPad OS or like iPad OS to Mac OS. So one of the operating system changes, like he kind of makes a break for it and then just starts like parkouring like down the steps and everything, and it was pretty incredible. So I am very much looking forward to seeing what kind of crazy antics that Craig gets up to at WWDC. As far as like actually some more specifics about the operating systems themselves, of course we're expecting every single one of their operating systems to get some sort of mention, if not like full scale, like update type thing. Obviously, we're going to get specific details about iOS, iPad OS, Mac OS. They'll probably also touch on watch OS too. They usually bring up some things there. They might talk about like the home app and maybe like the home pod maybe a little bit, and they might talk about tvOS a little bit. They'll probably talk about like shows coming to like Apple TV since they typically tend to do that as well. Let's see what else. Maybe they'll talk about CarPlay. I'm not sure, since there was like a couple weeks ago they did unveil like their whole next gen CarPlay thing, which if you remember that was something that they kind of announced at WWDC. I want to say like 3 years ago, 2 years ago, like a while ago, but is apparently now just starting to come out. It was one of those things where kind of the deadline kind of kept getting pushed back. Kind of like some of the other features that they announced last year that starts with A and ends in I. Apple Intelligence. But yeah, so we're gonna get updates from their various operating systems. But one of the rumors that people have been talking about is specifically iOS, and probably as a in relation, since iPad OS and iOS are basically the same for all intents and purposes. Like, of course, iPad OS has some extra features, but as far as like the visuals, they're basically the same. The rumor is that iOS is essentially going to be getting its largest redesign since iOS 7. Now, if you were around back in those days, iOS 7 was quite the hot topic when it came to people's opinions because, of course, prior to iOS 7, you had the skeuomorphic design language from Apple where, like, the Notes app actually looked like notepad paper. And basically, all the apps looked like real world objects. And then iOS 7 came around and basically redesigned everything, made everything very flat. And it caused a lot of strong opinions, shall we say. So I am very interested to see where they go with this. I'm interested to see what the redesign will look like. Um, but supposedly, this isn't going to be specifically to iOS. There's also rumors that macOS is going to get a fairly significant redesign as well. And some of the other kind of rumors and speculations is, if you've seen Vision OS, probably you haven't seen it in person given the sales numbers of the Vision Pro. But if you've seen videos of the Vision OS, one thing that jumps out almost immediately is how different the interface looks compared to like iOS. And I'm not necessarily talking about because it's like in the space around you, but how the icons look and how like you interact with the operating system. And supposedly some of those design elements from Vision OS are supposedly going to be coming into iOS, and I guess maybe even Mac OS as well. And speaking of Mac OS, it's also rumored that, well, I guess it has been alleged by the Lord and Savior of the Apple Leaks community, Mark Gurman, that the crack marketing team at Apple has decided upon Tahoe for the next macOS version. Now, I'm not going to say Mark Gurman is wrong, but typically speaking, a lot of software related things and marketing and business related things from Apple tend not to leak. And if they do, the accuracy is very hit or miss. And the reason for that is because Apple is able to keep a much tighter, I guess, lid on things software based and marketing based because all of that work is done in house. The reason why so many leaks come out about the design of the upcoming iPhone or the upcoming, Mac or whatever is from the supply chain because Apple can't necessarily have quite the ironclad grip on the supply chain that they, contract out to third parties as they can in-house to their own employees. So that is part of the reason, like I said, why typically you don't really see many leaks in regards to software features and things like that, naming conventions, because it's a lot easier for Apple to kind of keep that under wraps and keep a tight lid on it. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying that Mark Gurman is wrong because obviously I have no idea what the name for the upcoming Mac OS is. But Tahoe, I guess, would be an interesting name. So I guess maybe that's something to look forward to. We already mentioned this last week that Apple is planning to completely redo their naming system for their operating systems. So rather than kind of iterating the number every year, so not it's no longer like iOS 16, then 17, then 18, then 19, etc. Now they're going to whatever the year is. So it's going to be quite the jump from, Vision OS, Vision OS 2 to Vision OS 26. Same thing with iOS. It's going to be quite the jump. I guess also say for Mac OS and really all their operating systems. But like we talked about last week, the point is just for that kind of uniformity. Now, of course, it's going to be very weird right off the bat because you're not going to be used to seeing this massive number and it's a large delta between the previous version. But I think Apple's plan in the long run, and I think others have kind of speculated as such as well, is it's supposed to be meant for, I guess, better end user understanding and consistency. Since, like we touched on last week, if you're just an average, Joe Schmo on the street, and you hear about Vision OS 3 versus iOS 19, you're not necessarily going to know where those kind of fit together. And like we also said last week, some of us that are, more in tune to like the Apple operating systems, typically how we identify when an operating system came out is we identify a known place and time. So for instance, we know that, iOS whatever came out with this specific iPhone and this specific iPhone came out X number of years ago. So that means it's this many years old. So there's a lot of mental math that has to go on in order to determine those things. But if you just take the end of the year, it's a lot easier to know when iOS 26 came out, for instance. And one other good analogy I heard of why they're going with, say, iOS 26 compared to iOS 25 is they're kind of also going off of the like how sports games do their versioning. So like typically it'll be like for actually do sports version. Maybe I'm making that up, but cars especially, right? So like at the end of say at the end of 2024, you were seeing cars with the model year 2025, even though 2025 wasn't technically here. Same thing for this year. Once we get to kind of that like, fall type time frame, fall early early December type area, that's where you're going to start seeing the 2026 models out, even though we're still technically in 2025. So that's kind of, I guess, the theme that Apple is going to be going for there when it comes to their versioning. Supposedly, their AI feature announcements is going to be quite limited compared to last year, which, in all honesty, they're still trying to release the AI features that they announced last year. So if they did announce more AI features, they're basically just adding even more work to their backlog of, and they still haven't even shipped everything that they said they were going to. So I can't necessarily fault them for that. Um, it will be interesting to see how the overall, I guess, investor and media landscape reacts, because everything has to be AI based these days. And if you're not doing AI, like, what are you doing? You're falling behind. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that sentiment, but that's what people, I guess, are looking for. Um, some other things that are supposedly going to be coming. There's supposed to be a alleged dedicated gaming app for the iPhone. It's a My understanding from some of the rumors I heard is it's supposed to be kind of sort of like Game Center, but not, and kind of an improvement over Game Center. Not entirely sure that's going to work. I still do kind of find it a little entertaining that Apple is like just pushing so hard for like gaming over the past few years, when like anyone that's like super serious about gaming isn't buying an Apple product for the gaming. Now that's not to say that some games don't run pretty well on Apple devices, especially mobile games for sure. Like the iPhone is like, from my understanding, pretty top tier when it comes to mobile gaming performance. Um, but I don't think a lot of people are, sitting down for an evening and they're like, I want to play a video game, and they're just going to whip out their phone and start playing something for a while. Now, I'm sure there are people out there that do that, but maybe this is me going back to the games for the iPhone that existed, back in like, the earlier days of iOS, where it was pretty much just kind of a game that you would play while you're waiting for something, right? Like it was, you're sitting in a waiting room and you're trying to just burn time, and you don't necessarily have a ton of time to invest, but you also don't just want to sit there bored for 5-10 minutes or whatever the time is. So you just kind of take out your phone or your iPod or whatever, and you just kind of play a quick game. Now obviously the games have kind of improved over the years, but a lot of the kind of also the games they've been pushing for has been for the Mac too. And don't get me wrong, there are some games that run very well on the Mac, but if you're very serious about gaming, you're probably not getting a Mac. For one, compatibility, but two, you can get a lot better bang for your buck in terms of performance if you don't get a Mac. So that is one of the other trade-offs. And let's see, what else do we have? So some other things that we're not really expecting, at least based on rumors. Of course, Apple could change this. Supposedly, there's not supposed to be any really new hardware announcements that we're expecting. Um, Supposedly, there might be like support for spatial controllers for the Vision Pro, maybe. And there's supposedly going to be a new AirPods feature for like live translation and head gesturing controls. I guess we'll see if that comes out. I would suspect though that those AirPods features would be only for like the newest AirPods Pro, maybe the AirPods Max, not entirely sure. But that's probably going to be like a very restricted feature. And then I guess one other thing I should point out that I think kind of goes without saying, but it's often worth repeating. Just because you see a feature get announced at WWDC does not mean that your device is going to be getting that feature. Especially if you are on an Intel Mac. Any new feature that Apple announces for macOS, I think it's safe to say you're probably not going to be getting that. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, but a lot of the kind of fancy new features, like last year, they had the whole iPhone mirroring thing, right? But I'm like, that was like, I should have actually looked this up before recording this podcast. But I'm like 95% sure that that was an Apple Silicon only feature. Like you couldn't do that if you're on Intel Mac. And they've had some other features like that over the years where they would announce something, but only if you had like, these MacBooks could you get it to work. The other probably most notable and obvious example of this is Apple Intelligence. Obviously, if you're not running one of the latest and greatest iPhones, you don't have the system compatibility requirements in order to run Apple Intelligence, so you don't get to take advantage of it. Not like many of the Apple Intelligence features are even out yet. Well, I guess that might be a little bit disingenuous since some of them are out, but the big one that they really were pushing at last WWDC, the whole like context awareness thing where you could basically like talk interactively with Siri and it can like, look through your email and like schedule, invites and appointments and do all this stuff for you. None of that has come out yet, but some of the other things they talked about have. But of course, those are only available really if you have kind of the latest and greatest iPhones. So also just kind of let that. Don't get your hopes up too much if you see a new feature, because just because that feature is coming does not necessarily mean it is coming to your device per se. But yeah, so that's pretty much what to expect, what we're kind of looking forward to. I'm very excited to see it. I will definitely be watching it, and you can expect us to be covering it on next week's episode. So definitely be sure to stay tuned for that. But before we get out of here for this week's episode, let's get back to our trivia question for the week. So, this week's trivia question is, what was the name of the intelligent user interface office assistant for Microsoft Office from 1997 to 2003? So, what was the name of the intelligent user interface office assistant for Microsoft Office from 1997 to 2003? If you said Clippy, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. I'm kind of surprised I haven't had a Clippy trivia question before because Clippy was like such a big thing, back in the day. And I think a lot of people have memories of Clippy, whether they're good memories or bad memories. I'm not 100% sure, but people definitely have feelings towards Clippy. And, I'm wondering if Microsoft, when they kind of had their whole like recall thing and their whole Copilot, and they're like trying to shove AI like down everyone's throats into Windows, I'm wondering if it would have gone over a little bit better if they had someone like, if they basically brought back Clippy and had Clippy basically be the AI assistant. People might enjoy that a little bit more than, whatever the Copilot icon is or whatever it is. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's going to do it for this episode. So if you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you have any questions about this week's episode, or if you have any topics, ideas, or just anything in general for future episodes, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsInc.com. And of course, if you're on YouTube, you can just leave a comment down below and I will see that as well. And that's going to do it for me in this week's episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.